The Haunting Hour.
Sarah Chen hadn't meant to take the midnight train. Her normal commute was the 7:15 p.m. from London Victoria to Brighton, but tonight's late meeting with investors had dragged on endlessly, leaving her rushing to catch the last possible service, the infamous 11:55 p.m. train that locals called the Reaper's Run. She'd always dismissed the nickname as dramatic, even when her grandmother warned her never to take it, muttering old superstitions in Mandarin about hungry ghosts and the dangers of traveling at the spirit hour. The platform was eerily quiet when she arrived, her heels clicking against the worn tiles in a rhythm that echoed off the Victorian-era steel and glass ceiling. The usual evening crowds had long since dispersed, leaving behind only scattered newspapers and the lingering scent of stale coffee from the closed kiosks. The electronic board flickered overhead, displaying her train status. On time, in harsh orange letters that seemed to burn into her retinas. The train that pulled in was older than the usual rolling stock, its dark blue paint weathered and dull under the station's fluorescent lights. Sarah noticed something odd about the windows. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, like holes punched into the night itself. Still, when the doors hissed open with a sound like a dying man's last breath, she stepped aboard. She had no choice. Her cat needed his medication by morning. The interior light stuttered as she made her way down the aisle, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of any source. Sarah chose a seat in the middle of the car, her usual strategy for safety when traveling late. As she settled in, she realized something that made her stomach tighten. She couldn't remember seeing anyone else board the train, yet she distinctly heard footsteps and voices from both ends of the car. The train lurched into motion with an ungodly shriek of metal on metal. Sarah pulled out her phone, hoping to distract herself with emails, but the signal bars had disappeared entirely. Even more concerning, the time displayed was impossible. 12:47 a.m. They'd only just left Victoria at 11:55 p.m., and the first stop wasn't for 20 minutes. A child's laugh echoed through the car, causing Sarah to snap her head up. At the far end of the aisle, she caught a glimpse of a small figure in what looked like old-fashioned clothes, a pinafore dress and button-up boots, skipping past her row. But when Sarah turned to follow the movement, there was no one there. "Ticket inspection," announced a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It reminded Sarah of recordings played backward, familiar yet fundamentally wrong. The temperature in the car plummeted, and her breath began to fog in front of her face. Heavy footsteps approached from behind, accompanied by a rhythmic dragging sound and the persistent drip of water. Sarah wanted to turn around, but her muscles had frozen in place. A drop of ice-cold water landed on her shoulder, then another and another. "Ticket, please," gurgled a voice above her. "Everyone must show a ticket on the midnight service." Moving with mechanical slowness, Sarah turned her head. The conductor's uniform was soaked through, water cascading from the fabric in impossible quantities. Its brass buttons were green with corrosion, and barnacles clustered at the collar. But it was the face that made Sarah's scream die in her throat, bloated and pale as a fish's belly, with black algae growing in the crevices around eyes that glowed with the phosphorescent light of deep-sea creatures. I bought it on my phone," Sarah managed to stammer, her fingers trembling as she tried to pull up the digital ticket. The screen remained stubbornly dark. "No digital tickets on this service," the conductor said. its mouth opening far too wide, revealing row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. This is the old line, the original line, and we only take one form of payment here. More figures began to emerge from the shadows between seats. Passengers in clothes from every decade of the past century, all bearing the same waterlogged appearance. Their movements were jerky, like poorly operated marionettes, water splashing with every step. "You see," the conductor continued, its uniform suddenly dry and crisp, now bearing the insignia of the original London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, circa 1841. This line was built over an ancient river, a sacred stream, where pagans once made sacrifices to ensure safe passage through the dark. The railway company diverted the water, buried it deep beneath the tracks. But the old gods of that river, they never forgot. They still demand their toll. Sarah tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Water was pooling around her feet, rising impossibly fast. The other passengers, the things that had once been passengers, began to sing in harmonious, gurgling voices. "Pay the toll, join the roll, down below where dark streams roll." The child in the pinafore appeared beside her seat, skin grey and hair floating as if underwater, holding out a small, barnacle-encrusted hand. "It's not so bad, miss," she said sweetly, her voice bubbling. "We have ever so much fun down there, dancing with the old ones in the deep, and you'll never have to worry about being late for work again." The water was at Sarah's waist now, yet the train compartment remained intact. Impossible physics, creating an aquarium of horror around her. Through the windows, she could see faces pressed against the glass. Hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, all wearing expressions of peaceful acceptance as their hair waved in invisible currents. "Last call for tickets," the conductor announced, its form shifting between states, sometimes a modern uniform, sometimes Victorian dress, sometimes something older still, wearing robes that might have been ancient Roman or older. All passengers must pay their toll. Sarah felt cold hands grasp her ankles beneath the water. The last thing she saw before the dark water closed over her head was the train's route map transforming, the familiar line between London and Brighton becoming a twisted river of glowing symbols that hurt her eyes to look at. 3 days later, they found Sarah's phone on her regular seat on the 11:55 p.m. service. The screen displayed a single, unsent message. "Taking the late train. Don't believe what they say about the old river. It's all true. They're still collecting their toll. Whatever you do, don't take the midnight." The phone's screen flickered and died, water leaking from its speakers. That winter was the wettest on record for the London-Brighton line. Maintenance workers reported hearing singing in the tunnels, and passengers complained about the constant smell of river water in the last train of the night. Station staff began to notice that the 11:55 p.m. service always arrived with fewer passengers than had boarded. But oddly, no one ever seemed to file missing persons reports. In the control room at Victoria Station, the ancient analog departure board still clicks over each night at 11:54 p.m., displaying for just a moment a destination that no living person can read. And if you press your ear to the tracks late at night, they say you can hear the sound of water flowing deep below, and the happy laughter of children who've been riding the midnight service for a very, very long time. Some locals whisper that the old river gods are still there, counting their tickets in the deep places beneath London's modern streets. They say if you look carefully at the puddles that form on station platforms after rain, You might see faces looking back up at you, wearing Victorian clothes and peaceful smiles, eternally riding the subterranean rapids of their underwater train. As for Sarah Chen, there are those who swear they've seen her on late-night platforms, wearing a conductor's uniform that drips river water, checking tickets with pale fingers adorned with tiny barnacles. She's always very insistent that passengers must pay the proper toll. After all, the old gods of the river are patient, but they never forget what they're owed. And the 11:55 p.m. train continues to run every night, carrying its passengers to destinations that no longer appear on any mortal map, collecting fares for a journey that began long before the first railway was built, and will continue long after the last modern train has run its course. Just remember, if you're ever stuck late at Victoria Station, watching the last train of the night pull in through the rain, check your ticket carefully. The midnight service operates under very different rules, and its final destination might be somewhere you're not prepared to go. Now the next story will tell my small brother. Guys, over 87%. You don't subscribe me. It really hurts me. I do a lot of hard work. So please subscribe, and also comment me what I want to change or put more work on it. Michael Torres had spent 15 years conducting trains between Portland and Seattle without incident. That changed when his usual locomotive was replaced with an antique diesel engine that made his skin crawl. The worn brass plate read Engine 1949. Though Michael knew enough about train history to realize this model shouldn't exist. She's got a mind of her own, muttered Earl, the elderly station master. Been in storage since that incident in the 86. When Michael asked about the incident, Earl just shook his head and walked away, his keychain jingling like a funeral dirge. The passenger manifest showed 17 people for the late-night service. As Michael settled into the conductor's seat, he noticed the control panel looked wrong. Too many dials, strange markings that seemed to shift when viewed directly. The radio crackled with static, despite being turned off. They departed at 11:49 p.m. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows in rhythms that almost sounded like words. The headlights illuminated impossible things. Shadows moving against the wind, trees bending toward the train instead of away from it. The first sign of real trouble came when they passed Echo Junction, an abandoned stop they weren't scheduled to make. The notification system chimed. Now stopping at Echo Junction. All passengers from 1949, please prepare to rejoin your original service. Linda, his ticket checker, burst into the cabin. Michael, she whispered, we have too many passengers. We left with 17, but I counted 43. They're all dressed old-fashioned, and their tickets. She held out a yellowed punch ticket dated November 15th, 1949. The radio burst to life. Echo Junction welcomes the passengers of Service 1949. Your 75-year delay is now concluded. Michael's blood ran cold as he remembered the stories. Train 1949, which had vanished completely, with 43 passengers on November 15th, 1949. Looking at his engine's brass plate again, the numbers had changed to his current service number, 2218. The train entered a tunnel that shouldn't have existed. Through the darkness, Michael glimpsed other trains passing in impossible directions. Steam engines from every era, crowded with passengers whose clothes spanned centuries, their faces pressed against windows that faced each other across impossible geometries, each train trapped in its own temporal loop. "Welcome to Echo Junction," announced a voice from the engine itself. where all delayed services eventually arrive. The railway lines ahead began to spiral, not just horizontally, but vertically, forming a Mobius strip that looped through multiple time periods. Michael saw his old engine passing them, his own face visible in its window, endlessly conducting this same route across different decades. The passengers from 1949 began to disappear one by one, fading away with peaceful smiles as they reached their long-delayed destinations. But for each passenger that vanished, new ones appeared, travelers from other temporal splits, other delayed services seeking their proper times. Linda showed him her pocket watch, its hands spinning backward and forward. "The Junction is collecting us," she said, her voice now carrying the same ethereal quality as the old radio announcements. All those lost trains, all those missing services. It's been gathering them here, waiting for the right moment when all the temporal lines converge. The engine's whistle blew with a sound that seemed to fracture time itself. Through the windows, Michael could see other versions of Echo Junction, layered on top of each other. The original 1920s wooden platform, the 1950s concrete renovation, the modern glass and steel structure, all existing simultaneously. The controls no longer responded. The speedometer showed impossible numbers, measuring their velocity in years per second. Through the windscreen, he saw hundreds of trains converging on a single point of light, each carrying its own collection of temporal refugees. The last thing Michael saw before the light engulfed them was his reflection, not just his face, but every version of him that had ever conducted this route, would ever conduct it, all overlaid like a temporal palimpsest, each one realizing their service would never reach its scheduled destination. Today, if you check the arrivals board at Portland Station late at night, you might notice something strange. Between 11:48 p.m. and 11:50 p.m., all the times briefly show the same destination, Echo Junction. If you listen carefully, you can hear thousands of train whistles, each from a different time. As Service 22, 18 continues its endless journey through the temporal switches of the night. Some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear Michael Torres making his announcements. This is the service to Echo Junction. All passengers are advised that normal time no longer applies. Please have your temporal tickets ready for inspection. This train will make all stops forever. The railway company denies Echo Junction's existence, and all records of train 1949's disappearance have vanished. But late-night travelers sometimes report seeing an ancient diesel engine waiting at abandoned platforms, its brass plate showing different numbers each time, offering rides to those willing to step outside of conventional time. Now the next story will tell my small brother. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood hadn't taken a train in 20 years, not since that night in medical school when her twin sister Catherine disappeared on the Chicago-bound express. The official report claimed Catherine had never boarded, despite Elizabeth's insistence that they'd shared a sleeping compartment. Now, as a renowned psychiatrist specializing in shared delusions, Elizabeth found herself boarding another overnight train, drawn by a case that echoed her own loss with haunting similarity. 5 patients from different parts of the country, all claiming the same thing. They'd lost loved ones on night trains that officially never existed. Each described identical details: trains with black windows that reflected impossible things, conductors whose faces seemed to shift in the fluorescent lighting, and a final stop announced in a language that made their ears bleed. The Seattle to Chicago Empire Builder would take 48 hours. Elizabeth had booked a private sleeper car, number 218, the same one she'd shared with Catherine 2 decades ago. Her psychiatric mentor had warned against this investigation, calling it self-destructive. "You're looking for patterns that aren't there," he'd said, but the patient's stories contained details about Catherine's disappearance that had never been made public. The porter who showed her to her compartment was impossibly old, his uniform a style discontinued in the 1950s. "Welcome back, Dr. Blackwood," he said, though she hadn't told him her name. "The other doctor is already settled in." "What other doctor?" Elizabeth asked, but the porter had vanished. Her compartment door bore a tarnished brass number, 218. But when she blinked, the numbers rearranged themselves, 812. Inside, the sleeper car looked exactly as she remembered from 20 years ago, down to the peculiar coffee stain on the blue carpet. Elizabeth set down her medical bag and laptop, then froze. On the small fold-out table lay a familiar silver pendant, Catherine's favorite necklace, the one they'd bought together at a Prague flea market during their semester abroad. The train lurched into motion with a sound like distant screaming. Elizabeth grabbed the pendant, but it was ice cold, burning her fingers. She dropped it, and it skittered under the bed. When she knelt to retrieve it, she found instead a patient file she hadn't packed. The name on the tab read, "Blackwood, Catherine Temporal Displacement Syndrome." The file was written in her own handwriting, but the date stamps were impossible. Evaluations from the upcoming week, observations of symptoms she'd never documented. The most recent entry was dated tomorrow. "Patient exhibits classic signs of chronological doubling. Recommend immediate temporal isolation." Outside her window, the Seattle skyline was wrong. Buildings stood that hadn't been built yet, while others that should have been there were missing. The sky held two moons, one full and one crescent, casting conflicting shadows across the landscape. A knock at her door made her jump. "Doctor," called a familiar voice, her own voice. "We need to begin the evaluation." Elizabeth's psychiatric training warred with her rising panic. She knew the clinical terms for what was happening: dissociative episode, temporal lobe dysfunction, grief-induced psychosis. But none of them explained why her reflection in the window showed Catherine's face instead of her own. The door opened without her touching it. In the corridor stood herself, 20 years younger, wearing the same clothes she'd worn the night Catherine vanished. "We've been waiting for you," her younger self said. "All of us." Behind her younger self stood more versions of Elizabeth. One in her graduation robes, another in surgical scrubs, a third in a straitjacket. And among them, watching with sad eyes, was Catherine, exactly as she'd looked that last night. "Time isn't right on this train," Catherine explained. "It loops and curves. Some of us board in 1985, others in 2025, but we all arrive at the same station. I've been searching for you," Elizabeth whispered. "I know," Catherine said. "Every version of you has. That's the problem. You've created so many temporal copies looking for me that you've worn thin the walls between timelines. The train is trying to gather all the versions to collapse the paradox." The window beside them no longer showed the outside world, but another train car, where another Elizabeth and Catherine were having this same conversation. And through their window, Elizabeth could see another set, and another, stretching infinitely like facing mirrors. The train's whistle sounded like a flat line on a heart monitor. "Now approaching Terminus Station," announced a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "All temporal variants, please prepare for reconciliation." "What's happening?" Elizabeth asked, though part of her already knew. "You're a doctor," her younger self said. "Think of it like a chronic infection. Too many versions of us, spreading across too many timelines. The train is the antibody, gathering all the temporal strains to neutralize the paradox." Catherine took her hand. Her skin felt like old paper. "You couldn't let me go, Lizzie. Every time you tried to find me, you created another branch, another set of us. The weight of all those possibilities is collapsing reality around us." Through the windows, Elizabeth watched cities from different eras blur past, Seattle as it was, as it would be, as it never was. She saw other trains running parallel, each carrying its own set of Elizabeths and Catherines, all converging on a point of light in the distance that hurt her eyes to look at. The porter appeared again, now wearing a conductor's uniform that seemed to be made of living shadows. "Last call for temporal reconciliation," he announced. "All versions of passengers Blackwood must prepare for consciousness convergence." "I don't understand," Elizabeth said, but her other selves spoke in unison. "Yes, you do." She did. 20 years of psychiatric training helped her grasp the impossible truth. Her inability to accept Catherine's disappearance had created a temporal, tumor versions of herself, endlessly searching across parallel timelines. Each search spawning new alternates, new searches, new paradoxes. "The train has to contain the spread," Catherine explained. "It's gathering all of us, every Elizabeth who ever searched, every Catherine who was ever lost. At Terminus Station, we'll all collapse into one true timeline." "But which one of us will be real?" Elizabeth asked. "All of us," said her younger self. "None of us," said the one in scrubs. "Does it matter?" asked the one in the straitjacket. The train's wheels squealed like souls in torment as a reality bent around them. Through the window, Elizabeth saw her office in Seattle, where her secretary was discovering she'd never existed. She saw her parents' home, where photographs were slowly fading, replacing her image with empty spaces. She saw the medical school dorm, where it had all started, where security footage was rewriting itself to show only Catherine boarding the train that night. "It's time," Catherine said softly. "The paradox has to be resolved." The train entered a tunnel that seemed to be made of pure mathematics, equations describing the weight of too many possibilities trying to exist at once. Elizabeth felt her memories starting to merge with those of her other selves, graduating medical school in 1989, 2002, 2015, all simultaneously true and false. Now arriving at Terminus Station, the conductor announced in a voice that echoed through every possible timeline. "Please ensure you take all your consciousness with you." The light ahead grew brighter, and Elizabeth understood it wasn't light at all, but the absent space, where too many realities had worn a hole in existence. She felt Catherine's hand in hers, solid yet impossibly distant. "Will it hurt?" she asked, not sure which version of herself was speaking. "Only the memories we won't have anymore," Catherine answered. "Only the lives we'll never live." The train plunged into the light that wasn't light. Elizabeth felt herself coming apart and coming together. Every version of her life, shuffling like a deck of cards, being sorted into a perfect sequence. She was 7 years old, watching Catherine chase fireflies. She was 30, receiving an award for her research on shared delusions. She was tomorrow, yesterday, never, always. When the light faded, Elizabeth Blackwood opened her eyes in her Seattle office. Her secretary poked her head in. "Dr. Blackwood, your sister's here for lunch." Elizabeth blinked. On her desk sat a case file she'd never seen before, documenting a mass delusion involving passengers who claimed to remember trains that ran between timelines. The claim seemed absurd to her psychiatric mind. Catherine walked in, exactly as she'd always been, exactly as she'd never left. "Ready for lunch, Lizzie?" "I was thinking about that little Thai place, the one by the train station." For a moment, Elizabeth felt a strange vertigo, as if she were seeing multiple versions of her sister superimposed on each other. But that was impossible. Catherine had never disappeared, had never been lost. They'd never taken that train in medical school. They'd flown to Chicago instead. As they walked past the station, Elizabeth glimpsed her reflection in a train window. For a fraction of a second, she saw other versions of herself looking back, wearing clothes from different decades, their faces bearing different lines of grief and joy and searching. But when she looked again, it was just her own face, singular and solid. The train whistle sounded like a warning, or perhaps a lullaby. Elizabeth thought she heard it whisper, "Temporal reconciliation complete, paradox contained, reality stabilized." But that was ridiculous. Trains didn't whisper, time didn't bend. And sisters didn't disappear, only to be found in the spaces between what was and what might have been. Catherine touched her arm. "You okay?" "You looked lost there for a moment." "I'm fine," Elizabeth said, meaning it for the first time in a timeline she didn't remember living. Just thinking about parallel possibilities. Somewhere in the station, a conductor who might never have existed checked his watch and smiled. The temporal tumor had been successfully removed, reality had been healed, and Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood would never again dream of trains that ran between the moments of might have been. But sometimes late at night in her office, Elizabeth finds charts for patients she doesn't remember treating, all describing the same dream, a train where every window shows a different year, carrying versions of themselves toward a light that looks like tomorrow collapsing into yesterday. And in a forgotten filing cabinet in the hospital basement, in a folder that exists only when no one's looking for it, there's a conductor's log from a route that never ran, recording one final note: temporal paradox resolved, Blackwood sisters successfully reintegrated, reality stabilized, cost, every life they never lived, payment, accepted. The trains still run on time in Seattle, but if you listen carefully as they pass, you might hear the sound of other wheels on other tracks, carrying other possibilities towards stations that exist only in the spaces between what is and what was and what might have been, had a sister's love not torn a hole in time itself.